My name is Helen Hayward. I am the Deputy Chief Executive of the CPA UK branch. I'll be the chair for this session. We had hoped to have a Member of Parliament chairing this session, but it's coinciding with Prime Minister's question time, so the majority of them will be in the chamber. I'd like to just begin by explaining the objectives of the session. So it's a plenary session. We have 3 speakers, and the session will run as usual. We will have the presentations from the speakers followed by an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. The session is obviously running slightly behind time. We were due to start at 11:30, so if we need to, we will slightly over at the end. I'm afraid that will impinge on your lunch time, but we have got a reasonable break factored in. So the session is will explore global and large-scale private-public partnerships, asking how they can drive economic growth that is both equitable and sustainable. It will then examine examples of sustainable and responsible investment in 2 sectors, agriculture in East Africa and the manufacturing industry in Southeast Asia. It will place particular emphasis on asking what collaboration between local government units, CSOs, community organisations and the public sector really looks like at country level. So, speakers in order of their presentations. On my right-hand side, I have Serena Brown, who is the Global Development Initiative Senior Manager at KPMG International, where she works under the directorship of Lord Hastings, who most of you will have met at the reception last night at the FCO, applying KPMG skills to the pursuit of the MDGs, working alongside governments, civil society groups, international agencies and other private sector organisations. KPMG becomes fully involved in finding effective and sustainable solutions to global and local poverty issues. The next speaker we have will be Nigel Harris, just on my left, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Farm Africa, which is an international agricultural NGO founded in 1985 that works with farmers and rural communities in Eastern Africa to help them develop the tools to increase their harvests. They work across agricultural sectors to transform people's life outcomes by increasing their income, improving nutrition and their access to healthcare, whilst ensuring the protection of their environment. And then finally we'll have Dr. Basnett at the far left, who is here representing ODI, the Overseas Development Institute. Dr. Basnett leads ODI's research and technical advisory work on trade and economic development policies. For the past 8 years, he has been advising governments, bilateral and multilateral development agencies and civil society organisations on trade policy and negotiations, economic transformation, growth diagnostics, regional integration and labour migration. That's just a snippet of what the speakers are actually doing, but as we have a very short time to hear them speak, I will ask the first speaker, Serena Brown. Go ahead.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you all this morning. I understand that you had a sufficiently rousing speech from Lord Hastings, who I work with last night. And so today I've been asked to talk about 3 things. Firstly, how the private sector is participating in the Sustainable Development Goal process. Secondly, how companies are having a bit of an awakening in terms of how they view their role in society and the world. And thirdly, just to give a little bit of a flavour of how KPMG acts out some of this. So firstly, today things are very different from when the Millennium Development Goals were created. At that time, business was not really at the table. This time, business is very much involved. Back in 2012, KPMG convened a summit bringing together 600 business executives to talk about how to build business growth in a resource-constrained world. And some of the main recommendations from that fed into the Rio +20 summit. And some of them might be a bit of a surprise to you. Businesses did agree that government should send strong pricing signals about resource scarcity. They also felt that it was important that climate change is addressed, as well as multi-stakeholder partnerships. Following Rio +20, Paul Polman, who is the chief executive of Unilever, and in many ways a bit of a golden child in this sphere, led a huge business consultation with businesses around the world representing 10% of GDP to find out what contribution did they feel that they needed to make to the Sustainable Development Framework, and what were they looking for from government, and how did they think this should shape into the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was a key part of the high-level panel report that was submitted last year. Today, as businesses, we're working with, I would say, 4 main organizations to continue to feed into that process. The first is the UN Global Compact. Is everyone familiar with the UN Global Compact? There are about 10,000 business signatories that voluntarily have signed up to 10 principles in the areas of labour, human rights, anti-corruption, and the environment, and also wider UN principles like the Millennium Development Goals. Secondly, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Thirdly, the UN Foundation. And finally, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that is being led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs to bring together particularly academia and businesses to look at what are some really impactful new solutions to address some of the biggest development challenges. Ahead of the UN General Assembly that took place in September, a number of businesses came together to really, again, express their commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and input into that process. And within about a week, the companies with the logos up there signed this business manifesto. Many other companies are now joining. We expect more and more to over the coming weeks and months. And it was a 10-point manifesto. I don't have time to go into all the 10 points, but some of them that I think are particularly interesting is business really feels strongly that the principle of universality is appropriate. This needs to apply to all countries, not just to what were considered at the time to be poorer countries back when the MDGs were set. Climate change does need to be addressed. I think sometimes that's a surprise to some people in government and civil society, because obviously businesses, on the one hand, will have a cost incurred or have to dramatically change their business models in order to have that addressed. But there is a growing recognition that we can't continue the way we are. There was a recommendation that there should be a global multi-stakeholder partnership for each and every goal. We do think there are too many proposed goals from the Open Working Group. We would prefer to have 10 as a clear number that people can hook onto. There needs to be a focus on clear means of implementation. So one of the challenges with the Millennium Development Goals is they were great aspirational goals, but there was no strategy and implementation plan and financing plan for how we were going to make them happen. And some of the multi-stakeholder partnerships are really key in this, but there are also a number of other things that are happening to try to address that. I don't think I have to explain to you how important the private sector is. I think you already know that, and you had some talks about that last night. But just to summarize some of the key areas, businesses are increasingly investing in human capital, skills development, looking at how to make infrastructure investment more resilient, but also leverage more of the long-term capital, particularly capital that is managed on behalf of many of these pension funds for infrastructure, looking at how to build a vibrant consumer base. So how do you innovate in terms of products and operating models to reach new consumers? Where is growth going to come from for many of these big multinationals in the UK that are clearly not going to find much growth here? And how do companies act more responsibly to promote anti-corruption and market transparency? So one of the key initiatives that we at KPMG are driving together with the UN Global Compact is the development of a sustainable development industry matrix. So we're hearing a lot of people saying private sector has to be a big part of the solution, private sector needs to provide the money, private sector needs to step up, but actually what is that going to look like? So we felt there was a bit of a vacuum in making the conversation a bit more tangible and recognizing the unique contributions that different industry sectors have to make. So what we're doing is we're grouping the SDGs into 10, and we're focusing on 10 sectors initially, which we see are already doing a lot around sustainable development and have a really high potential to do more. So those are financial services, energy and natural resources, healthcare and life sciences, industrial manufacturing, infrastructure, and food, beverage, and consumables. And for each of those, we are identifying what are 3 really good examples of leading practices by businesses in that industry to drive sustainable development, not just in a philanthropic way, but in a way that will create business value at the same time as creating societal value. And then we're also coming up with 3 examples of where we think there's an opportunity for companies in that industry to really go further. And that's not a comprehensive list of all the things that are happening, but we hope that it will be a good conversation starter. We are planning to hold business roundtables with chief executives at Davos around this, and the UN Global Compact is going out to all its lead members, which are considered to be the companies that are really excelling on this agenda. On Friday there's a big meeting in New York to get their input. So the idea is that this is not just a document, but it's part of a conversation and a process, so that businesses who are already acting on this will go further, but also we recognize that sometimes we are preaching to the converted, and there is still a big tail of businesses that have not yet woken up to this opportunity. So we hope that this will help with that awakening. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, many of your countries are participants in these. I just want to emphasize how absolutely critical these are. There are initiatives covering most areas now, scaling up nutrition, global partnership for education. A lot of companies like KPMG, having fairly recently signed up to the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, which looks at how do we model greater women's empowerment within our organizations as well as within our sphere of influence. And one final thing that is just at the beginning of being developed at the moment is a guide for business action. So again, focusing on this means of implementation. So how will we go about assessing which goals are most important, how we define them for business, how we assess our impact, what indicators we use, and again, 3 key organizations that are leading those. So how is business's view of its role in the world evolving? I quite like this cartoon from the FT that says, before shareholders just wanted great returns, now they want ethical ethically driven, environmentally concerned, ecologically sustainable big dividends. And I think that's just one group of stakeholders that's applying pressure for this transformation. The other big thing that we have at the moment that's been building and building is a huge crisis of trust. So we're constantly seeing big scandals, whether it's the banking industry or other sectors, and how is business going to restore trust that's essential for successful business? They need to go further to demonstrate they're making a positive contribution to the world. Our employees, especially the younger generation Y, want to work for companies that are actively contributing to the world being a better place. And where is growth going to come from? So there's just a few of the drivers. So back in the old days, the approach that a lot of companies took was, how do we comply with rules and regulations? How do we not do any harm through the course of our business activities? And then we must also do a bit of philanthropy, a bit of charity. Obviously, that's good. However, philanthropy is really important, but on the whole, it's the 1% of the profits. But how is the 99% made? And so increasingly business is looking for, how do we add value to society and the world at the same time? What does this mean for you as parliamentarians? How can you help business to go in the right direction more quickly? I would encourage you to get companies in your countries to sign up to the UN Global Compact, those 10 principles. One of the great things is companies have to publish every year the progress that they're making, so there's always that positive cycle of progress. I would definitely encourage participation in some of these big multi-stakeholder partnerships. As you work out how the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be fit into your own development and planning context, I would strongly encourage you to make the most of using private sector platforms, so engage as much as you can with chambers of commerce, trade associations, and other private sector groupings. One interesting thing that we have here in the UK is all-party parliamentary groups. We have one on corporate responsibility. These are cross-party groups led by members of the House of Parliament and peers, and that's a good way of progressing the discussion with businesses and others on this agenda. Emulating good practices, we feel very much that moving on a journey from financial reporting to integrated reporting, which also gets companies to think about what is a new vision of value, where you report on your societal and environmental value, is really important. And there's some good practice, particularly recently following Rio+20 coming out of South Africa in the EU on mandatory reporting. So very briefly, just to give you a small flavour of how KPMG practices some of what it preaches. First and foremost, we have our primary purpose, which is supporting transparency, accountability, and helping the capital markets to work well through our accounting advisory services. But in addition to that, we focus mostly on supporting learning and livelihoods. Some of that is through cash donations, some of it is through skill sharing, and also through strategic leadership. So working, for example, with the UN Global Compact on a guide for companies doing responsible business in high-risk areas. I'm just going to give you three quick examples of some of the global initiatives that we're involved in. One is Enactus. This is a fantastic student-led initiative. It involves university students mostly who have ideas for setting up social enterprises. They get funding, they run those social enterprises, and they get mentored by people from KPMG and other big businesses, and then they have competitions in their country leading to a big World Cup that just took place in China. And I think this is a really neat example that brings together corporate support for education, helping students to get work readiness skills that they don't always get just through academic qualifications, and actually having really great community impact as well. I think there might be some people here from Zanzibar, Tanzania. This is a village that KPMG supports in Pemba, off the coast of Tanzania. We have 23 of our countries have come together to contribute $2 million to support all sorts of development there. So education, primary health care, helping seaweed farmers. Picture there of Lord Hastings, who you saw last night, with the Ministry of Health, looking at how do we build the health system ready for transition. And then the final example is just around disaster response and resilience. Another key discussion that the private sector is really part of at the moment is around a successor framework for the Hyogo Framework for Action on Disaster Risk Reduction. And increasingly companies are thinking not only how do we give money to help with disaster response, but how do we help to drive more resilient investment, help working with government, civil society to reduce the risk of disasters and increase preparedness, so combining that skills and core business with the cash financing. So that's my time up. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much. So can I ask Nigel, please?
Thank you. I feel I may be too big for this podium, but bear with me. Good. So let me add my thanks to those of Serena. Good afternoon, I think it is now, ladies and gentlemen. So good afternoon to you all. Many thanks. And may I start by just saying what a privilege it is for me, certainly, to address such a distinguished audience here today. So I've been asked to talk to you about responsible investment in agriculture in particular, with an East Africa focus, so a little bit more of a deep dive, and sustainable growth, and what we have learned about what works and frankly what doesn't work in public-private partnerships, and what this means in terms of working together across sectors, and in particular the key role of smallholder farmers in that. So I'll briefly introduce myself, then provide an overview of what we believe to be the crucial role of smallholder farmers in agricultural development. I'll then give 3 practical examples of partnership from our own work, drawing out some wider themes from that, and then finish by offering some conclusions, if I may, for all of us, and particularly, obviously, for those of you who are in government. So just briefly, first to introduce Farm Africa, that's our mission behind me. We're a medium-sized, about $25 million turnover international NGO. We're an East Africa specialist, and we unleash the abilities of small farmers to grow their incomes and manage their natural resources sustainably. Those are our real key metrics of success. And we work at the overlap of economic and environmental sustainability, really building the capacity of communities to adapt, to develop resilience, to increase productivity, and increasingly to access markets. And we think we have a particularly vital place in the development spectrum, as we strongly believe in the importance of helping farmers access and work with markets in the private sector to help themselves out of poverty. Just a quick note on me, as I said, I'm Nigel Harris, I'm the Chief Executive of Farm Africa. You can tell from my accent that I'm British, and then therefore, in many ways, totally inappropriate to stand in front of you and talk to you about responsible investment in agriculture in East Africa. But bear with me, I'm trying to do this, I think, from the perspective of the farmer. Within my team are 200 East Africa staff who working in rural and sometimes remote communities, often in the communities in which they grew up, working on community-led resource management, knowledge transfer, access to markets. So I hope in front of you today I can represent them, and perhaps even more importantly to represent those whom Farm Africa serves, smallholder farmers, usually farming less than 2 hectares, herders, forest communities. And as I say, this will inevitably have a strong Africa theme, particularly an East Africa focus. That's our expertise, but I hope there will be broader lessons for all of us. So the title I was given highlights sustainable economic growth. The International Development Act here defines sustainability as development that generates lasting benefits for both present and future populations. I think I'm being waved at to slow down, so let me slow down a little bit. So I trust that you'll agree with me that this implies the need to get both institutions and social and environmental safeguards right, in addition, of course, to growth. And sustainability has not only economic dimensions, but it clearly has social and, crucially, environmental ones as well. So why is it good to invest in agricultural development? Well, you all know the statistics, and some of them are some of the points are here on this slide. And this is taken from a review of the evidence on agriculture and poverty produced by the Department for International Development here in the UK, DFID here in the UK, and published this year. And you'll see poverty reduction from growth in agriculture is 2 to 4 times greater than from other sectors. Yet the review also highlights the importance of context and, of course, of local capacity. As you see there, a focus on agricultural development is most appropriate when a higher proportion of increased income is likely to be spent locally and on locally produced goods and services. When there is capacity in the local non-farm economy to increase production in response to increased demand, and where crucially smallholders have the capacity to increase scale of production or indeed the value of produce. But why invest in smallholders? Now, we're clearly biased. You would expect me to be biased. We work with about 1.5 million smallholder farmers and their direct families on an annual basis, as you see here. But from an African perspective, agriculture still dominates, roughly 2/3 of the workforce and 1/3 of GDP. And as you know, more importantly, 90% of African agricultural production still comes from smallholders, 80% of whom are farming less than 2 hectares. It's a simple observation that smallholder farmers remain the dominant player in agriculture, certainly in the areas of East Africa in which we work. And if we're looking for sustainable agricultural growth, it would be odd to do so without thinking about those who produce 90% of the continent's food. But there are challenges, and I don't want to underplay those. Small farmers can't achieve economies of scale that the larger operators can. And there are currently huge transaction costs in both input markets and output markets. And of course we can raise broader challenges. Let me name a few. Security of tenure would be one. Infrastructure, financing, education, and management. Yet of course one person's challenge is another's opportunity. On the question of financing, for example, the consultant Stahlberg estimated a couple of years ago that the demand for smallholder finance worldwide could be as much as $450 billion. That's for the roughly 500 million smallholder farmers. And that's largely unmet so far. And so far that's unmet because of virtually insurmountable transaction costs. But the exciting thing is that those are now dropping away very rapidly due to technological advances in mobile banking. And the economic arguments dovetail very well with the social ones, of course. So let me talk very briefly about gender. Women smallholders, as you know, often carry out the bulk of the work on the farm. Yet despite many communities' dependence on women to grow food, they often lack access to land, extension services, credit, quality inputs that can enhance farm productivity. Women, as you know, receive less than 10% of all credit going to smallholder farmers. Women farmers, it's estimated, could grow 30% more food if they had access to the same resources as their male counterparts. And by helping women farmers in particular boost production, countries could see an increase of around 2.5% to 4% in agricultural output, which would feed an additional 150 million people. So in short, agricultural smallholder farmers dominate the agricultural scene in Africa. They're here to stay for many more years. And they may, of course, yet surprise us in terms of their adoption of new technologies and their contribution to growth. A market such as cocoa, of course, illustrate the potential of smallholders to supply serious market demand at some scale. But that issue of scale is one that we all want to reach for. In a way, it's our second goal as an organisation, as you can see here, which is to create models that can go to real scale. And we do that through partnerships. Partnerships with government, and partnerships, of course, with the private sector, which is what I want to come on to now. So how do we make this happen? How do we boost production and increase well-being amongst Africa's smallholder population? I'm not going to give you any easy answers, there are none, but to illustrate ways of working right now that we hope can help to create effective agricultural growth. There is, as you know, a huge yield gap in a lot of African agriculture, which will only be overcome by putting in place functioning input and output markets and attracting private sector finance. This is, of course, at the end of the day, a private sector game, but it's not only about the private sector. It needs the support of governments, it needs the engagement of rural communities, and it needs, believe it or not, civil society organisations like mine to link private sector investment and demand to smallholder producers. The challenge for lawmakers and governments, of course, more broadly, is to put in place the conditions to make this happen. So, okay, so much for the theory. Let me talk about our experience in helping smallholder farmers to become part of a demand-driven, commercially viable supply chain, thus raising their incomes in a sustainable and, we hope, a scalable way. And we see these as public-private community partnerships, PPCs if you like, rather than PPPs, with agencies like Farm Africa playing a critical but also time-limited role as catalyst and provider of technical input and advice. So my first example is actually from Ethiopia, where we worked with the multinational company Diageo, the big multinational drinks provider, the government of Ethiopia, including the Ministry of Agriculture and the new Agricultural Transformation Agency, the ATA, and ourselves, in what was very much a pilot scheme to source barley locally for breweries that Diageo had recently purchased in Ethiopia. So we recruited just under 1,000 farmers for the pilot. We organised procurement, distribution of inputs, and we were primarily responsible for farmer training, securing the contracts with the farmers, support to local extension officers monitoring performance. The good news is that high quality barley was produced. In fact, Diageo were remarkably surprised how good it was. But there were challenges: agglomeration, the purchase process, establishing transport payment systems that work. But it was, after all, a pilot. We, Diageo, the government of Ethiopia, the ATA, took out some really good lessons, of which I'll come back to later. And Diageo are now scaling that intervention at some scale in a very exciting way. But of course, PPPs, or PPCs, if I can get away with that phrase, don't have to involve a multinational player. So let me give you two other examples of how Farm Africa, an NGO committed to building sustainable development and linking farmers to functioning markets, is helping stimulate these private public community partnerships at grassroots level. So SIDI Africa Limited is a social enterprise. It's a Kenyan for-profit company that we helped set up, and it helps livestock keepers get better access to quality inputs and services. You can see beside me, or behind me rather, an overview. And so numerous studies show that poorer livestock keepers are both willing and able to pay for quality accessible services and products. But the issue has been how to get those products to the farm gate. So with SIDI, we help to establish a financially viable farm input market using a franchise business format that delivers high quality, affordable products through a network of franchised outlets across Kenya to livestock farmers. And then my next two slides give a little bit of a glimpse of the change that we're trying to bring from that, if you're shopping in your local village, to something that looks more like that. SIDI currently has nearly 100 franchises now in place across Kenya, including some company-run stores that act as distribution hubs. And we're working, well, SIDI more accurately is working with some 70,000 farmers. And crucially, it works closely in partnership with the Kenyan Veterinary Board. It's been appointed a distributor of East Coast fever vaccine by the Director of Veterinary Services, and it's being used by the government parastatal laboratory, Kevavapi, to distribute vaccines. In other words, it's a PPP, but it's a local one. And the final model I want to touch on is our Mandaleo Agricultural Enterprise Fund. And that's because increasing agricultural income and overall productivity on a sustainable basis requires a focus not just, of course, on production, but also linkages to profitable markets, and developing alternative business models that enable buyers to collect, grade, process, package crops competitively from large numbers of small-scale producers. Now, micro businesses, SMEs if you like, but really on the micro end, are based in rural areas, are very well positioned to do this, but they struggle, in our experience, to access investment capital due to their size or their inability to produce recognizable business plans to attract more mainstream investors. And so by extending investment and technical assistance beyond the farm gate to these buyers, our MEF fund enables them to penetrate new markets and exert a pull effect on thousands of smallholders who know how to produce, but not necessarily how to market their products. Just one example, it's recently supported a macadamia supplier which identified cashew nuts in the coastal region of this part of East Africa as a prime product for expansion, given the subsequent seasons and the ready market with many of its existing macadamia buyers. And so with the help of the MEF fund and of Farm Africa, this business has been able to mobilize 2,000 cashew farmers against its original target of 1,500, providing training, capacity building, including technical training for improved yields, business training for better group organization and management. And by formalizing those farmer groups, increasing the value of production through both fair trade and organic certification, the company has played a crucial role in increasing the price that farmers get paid locally, and at the same time in 2014 it's doubled its turnover from last year. So look, from our work at grassroots level in these and other partnerships, I believe that we have some lessons worth sharing, although I hasten to say I do this very much as a humble practitioner in front of you, very aware that these are complex issues and not easily solved. But these are some of the lessons that we're taking out. Who pays startup costs? Supply chains involving smallholders must over time, of course, be economically sustainable, but there's often a need to kickstart those supply chains through training, basic infrastructure and extension services. And while these, of course, are crucial and critical success factors for the commercial endeavour, the payback may be too long-term for the commercial player, leading to a key role, I think, for public funding and for agents such as Farm Africa, but with a clear exit strategy for both. We need to balance specific commercial interest, of course, as well, with wider impact. There's a number of public good aspects of this type of engagement: post-harvest technology, mainstreaming climate-smart techniques, investment in new seed varieties, reaching out more effectively to women farmers and young people, and supply chains that work with smallholders provide great platforms to build that impact. But the commercial partner needs to have a business case that works, and we've got to hold that intention. Thirdly, it takes time. It's an obvious statement, but productivity gains can be delivered rapidly. Fully integrating smallholders into a functioning supply chain takes a lot longer. That's about changing behaviours, it's about building trust, and those are long-term activities. And all partners, including people like ourselves, but including government, need to be realistic on that timing. The financing gap needs to be bridged as much as the technology gap. There's rightly a focus on closing yield gaps, providing better technologies, higher quality seeds, fertilizer, drought-tolerant crops, climate-smart approaches, as I've mentioned. But there's a huge need for long-term financing for farmers and companies as well that engage with smallholders. And regulatory frameworks need to enable those national financial institutions to invest and help enterprise development occur efficiently. We've got to build management skills at a local level. This isn't a myth. Informal farmer groups that change into more formal cooperatives or business, or as local entrepreneurs build their businesses, they need to learn how to do the basics well. Civil society has a role to play, facilitate the interactions with smallholders, setting up farmer groups, gender, environmental considerations, putting in place social environmental safeguards. But it's not just about the NGO's own survival. And to be slightly flippant, when you've met one small farmer, you've met one small farmer. Context on all of this is all important. We tailor our interventions very much to local context. Right, I promise this is my last slide because I'm aware of time. But look, to conclude, there's an opportunity to put in place an agricultural economy that will not only feed people now, but also in the future. But there are major obstacles that stand in the way for private investments to occur. And this is where NGOs like mine, but also state actors like you, can help. Putting in place a positive investment climate, including financial institutions that can provide appropriate risk-adjusted capital, the need of security of tenure for a variety of counterparties, including smallholders, stable legal framework and justice system, building local capacity both on the supply and the demand side, with a focus, as I've said, on financial, technical and managerial skills, creating a wider enabling environment and getting even companies to share lessons, not an easy one, focusing on demand-led solutions for sustainability. What is the market for the product? Who wants it and why? And using subsidies with care. Of course, markets work best when all participants gain, and that may need some short-term subsidies, but long-term subsidy can lead to dependence and dysfunction in local markets as well as wider ones. And valuing the natural environment. Sustainability is a long-term word. Short-term economic growth that harms the economy, harms the environment, does nobody any good in the long term. We need to ensure that all parties, including private sector, government, communities, that take responsibility for managing natural resources, explore a range of appropriate financing models, carbon financing, payment for ecosystem services, to name but two. So I hope that's been of help to give you very much a bottom-up practitioner's view. My thanks to all of you for your time and patience, and again, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel. Can I now invite Dr. Basnett to speak?
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished Excellencies, Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, it is truly an honor to address you and to share with you some ideas on how we can leverage investments for sustainable development. Let me begin by placing in front of you two issues that I believe are key development challenges for us, and by include myself coming from a developing country. The first is to have a sustained economic growth, and we would like to have a growth that is both inclusive, that generates jobs for the vast majority. The second issue is that not only is climate change real, but there are planetary boundaries to what can be done and what sort of growths can be achieved. And I believe the two, when put together, present what I think are the next set of development challenges for most developing countries. And I feel that in that context, we need to bring investments. Investments on its own are not golden goose that lays golden eggs. It has to deliver some specific objective for developing countries. So the question really becomes, when does or what kind of investments will help developing countries achieve inclusive growth and achieve sustainable development. And let me propose to you or put forward, present to you that I believe that when investment increases productive capacity, and Nigel spoke very eloquently with lots of examples on that, when investment increases productive capacity of developing countries, it helps developing countries achieve inclusive growth. And let me quickly clarify what I mean by that. It is not about merely producing more of what is already being produced. That is desirable but not sufficient. Investments need to help countries add value to what you're already producing, or build capacity to produce new products. And I think that is quite an important element. So when investments are helping countries build capacity to add value to what is being produced and to move into new products, then I think investment is leading towards an inclusive economic growth. The second element that I would like to present to you is on the dimension of sustainable development. When investment also accompanies technology transfer, it will help achieve sustainable development. And what I mean by that is investments that allow countries to produce perhaps the same goods, but in a cleaner manner and in a more environmentally sustainable manner. That sort of investments are desirable in that they promote sustainable development. If you accept that premise of mine, let me ask you to come with me in exploring 3 examples, and I've randomly chosen these countries. It could be examples that cross-cut into experiences in Africa as well, but Nepal, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And the 3 countries couldn't be more different from each other. 2 are LDCs. One is a rapidly developing emerging economy. One is a landlocked country, Nepal. Bangladesh and Indonesia perhaps share a lot of commonalities, not least as having similar religious population. Yet they are on different spectrums of development. And what I find interesting is the 3 of them have, in different sectors, been able to achieve the sort of investment that I was earlier hinting at. Let me begin with Bangladesh, and I know there are parliamentarians from here, so I stand to be corrected by them. And garments, and I was saying that at the committee, garments kept coming up, and it is much talked about. One of the key insights that I find really interesting about the garment sector in Bangladesh was it started by a Korean company, sorry, let me correct myself. The garment sector was always there in Bangladesh since its independence, but a Korean company's investment, and I believe it's Daewoo, made a remarkable impact on the growth of that sector because it was able to transfer the know-how and knowledge and management skills. The Korean company went to Bangladesh with a very different set of incentive. They were what you could say quota hopping, because at that time there was a multi-fiber agreement that was being phased out, so they needed to find another country where they could produce garments to export to the advanced economies. I've traveled through some of the countries in Africa, and you see a similar example coming up where you have investors preference hopping now. So they want to take advantage of the AGOA agreement to export to the US. They set up companies. And the question really that confounds me is, why hasn't the garment industry in Africa been able to take the same routes that it did in Bangladesh? So what is so unique about Bangladesh? And I don't have the answer, and I think that is a question that we need to think about. But perhaps the earlier investments that the government did into the garment industry had created the basic foundations to build in. So by merely bringing an investor to open up a factory and start producing garments doesn't work. You need strong backward linkages. You need the presence of strong backward linkages for a foreign investor to build on. The second example that I want to turn to is Nepal. I come from Nepal. We practically live in darkness. There's no electricity. And we are told that we are the second largest hydro resource in the world after Brazil. And a lot of it had to do with the productive capacity to translate hydro energy into electric energy. And investment was a key critical constraint. And what we got there was a cooperation between the different actors in the country, which included the government, but also the donor agencies, the private sector, to reform the law whereby it allowed scope for private investors to start investing in the hydroelectric sector. Just a month or 2 ago, a company has confirmed it will be investing to a tune of $1.6 billion in hydroelectric production. And we've moved from a phase where we had electricity shortage to now into a phase where we are discussing about exporting electricity to the rest of the South Asia region, but to start with at least to India. But an important debate or discussion has already started in the country, which is, are we really going to export electricity and be caught up in a new sort of a resource curse? So how do we now translate the benefits of investments into hydroelectricity and the production of electricity into building the productive capacity so that the rest of the economy can generate jobs and employment for the population? So just having a huge dam that produces electricity and you sell it to India is not sufficient because it won't create inclusive growth. Thirdly, let me come to Indonesia. It has had a very successful period of high rates of growth, largely driven on commodities, commodity boom. And now that not only is the commodity boom coming to an end, it is having to rediscover issues about inclusive growth and how does it generate inclusive growth in the economy. The recent elections there is quite remarkable and telling on that front, on who the country voted as their president and the policies that he stood for. And one of the critical areas in Indonesia is public transportation or infrastructure, and it resonates with a lot of the developing countries. Nigel was mentioning in Africa as well. But infrastructure is a government alone cannot address the issue of infrastructure. There are huge issues of financing gap. And we've got issues, we've got models of public-private partnership. There have been work done on improving the investment climate. But what I find quite critical is in most developing countries, you have pervasive market failure. And by that what I mean is you've got incomplete markets, or risks are too high for an investor to come in and invest, especially in areas of infrastructure. What Indonesia has done with the help of donors and others is set up an infrastructure bank that acts as a guarantor or as one of the lenders. And it has accompanied that with the standard one-stop investment offices to help others, to help investors come in. And instantly, there you've got a massive investment that from China, which is going to link 2 islands over the ocean. You've got investments from the Japanese on Japanese private sector on building road infrastructure. So the point that I'm trying to drive at is that there are issues of market failures, even in a much more advanced economy like Indonesia. And for that, you need to have an active government policy to address before you can expect an investor to come and find that the investments are going to be not only safe, but are going to be profitable. So let me try to think of how we can think of some golden threads on investments for sustainable development, or what sort of policies can lead to investments for inclusive and sustainable development. And I try to, rather than going through a wish list or a shopping list, I'll try to make this relevant to the audience, which is mostly members of parliament from developing countries. And I think the first element is having a development vision. And as varied and as abstract it sounds, I think it is quite important to have a clear development vision. Where are you? Where do you want to get to? Answering those questions would be the first step. And the reason for that is political uncertainty is often quoted as being an issue for investments not taking place in many developing countries. But political uncertainty is an aspect of politics. And I don't think so in any democratic society or institution, you can completely do away with political uncertainty. So I think addressing political uncertainty is through having a clear development vision that not only all the political parties buy to, but the nation as a whole accepts it. So what you have is you can have different politics or political parties coming going into power, but the overall course of the country stays the same. And I think that if you have that, it speaks a lot to the investors. The second issue is using the parliament or your legislative body and using the power to convene. And I think that there's a huge role there or space there, because often a lot of the policies are just left to technical details and not given sufficient political backing. And I say this through some personal experiences working with some parliamentarians in developing countries, where parliamentary committees have played a tremendous role in shaping not only the ministry's policies, but overall the national policies on investments, but also on a whole host of economic sectors. Let me conclude by saying that there are few things that I haven't touched on, but I should put it out on the floor with regards to investment. Is foreign investment is just an aspect of the overall portfolio of investment that flows into developing countries. And one area that I think even till now remains largely untapped when connecting to inclusive and sustainable development are remittances. And I think that is an area that has not been thought of or articulated in the policies sufficiently. Because in many of the developing countries, remittance inflows are far higher than FDI and even aid. And majority of that remittance goes into consumption, and rightly so, because that is what remittance in the first place needs to help the household that is receiving the remittances. But there's a huge amount of liquidity that it generates in the economy, and also there's huge potential for savings that remittances generate. And I've gone to some places, communities where you have remittance inflows, and I know they would rather hide the money in the mattress than invest it. And I've seen some governments who have created what they call the remittance bond to incentivize migrants to purchase these bonds, and the bonds would then be used for investment in infrastructure. Two problems that came up in this particular instance. One was the rate of return was far lower than giving it to your friend who was going to be a migrant. So you would get a better rate of return. Second is trust deficit. If you are coming from a faraway village, you're not going to hand over your hard-earned money to a government in the capital who you may not completely trust. So I think that those two things need to be addressed. But I think we also need to move from an era of just speaking about looking at different sorts of investment flows into the country and thinking about investment, looking at them as in silos, to looking at them in a holistic manner to ask the question, how can we leverage the financing that comes through investment in addressing issues of inclusive and sustainable development goal? Thank you, Chair.